Imagine buying a phone that costs over $1,000. You pay for the hardware. You pay for the apps. You pay for subscriptions inside those apps. And yet, buried deep inside that glass and metal rectangle is a silent toll booth, one that decides who can sell to you, how they can sell to you, and how much of every transaction they must surrender. This is not science fiction. This is the reality that exploded into public view when Epic Games declared war on Apple. And what followed wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a corporate power struggle that ripped open the app economy, exposed how control really works, and forced the world to ask a terrifying question. Do you actually own your phone? Or are you just renting access? This story begins quietly, almost invisibly, with a 30% cut. For years, Apple's App Store commission was treated as the cost of doing business. Developers complained, but most complied. Apple framed it as payment for security, distribution, and access to over 1 billion users. And for a long time, that explanation worked, until one of the most powerful game companies on Earth decided it had had enough, and chose the most explosive way possible to challenge the system. Epic Games wasn't just another developer. This was the company behind Fortnite, one of the most profitable digital products in history, generating billions annually and dominating global culture. Epic understood leverage. It understood timing, and it understood spectacle. So in August 2020, Epic deliberately violated Apple's App Store rules by introducing its own in-app payment system inside Fortnite. The goal was not to sneak around Apple. The goal was to provoke Apple. Apple responded within hours, removing Fortnite from the App Store. And that was exactly what Epic wanted. Because minutes later, Epic filed a lawsuit accusing Apple of operating an illegal monopoly, abusing its dominance, and extracting unfair rents from developers and consumers. Simultaneously, Epic released a cinematic parody of Apple's iconic 1984 commercial, casting Apple as the authoritarian giant it once claimed to fight against. This was litigation as performance art, and it instantly captured global attention. At the center of the Epic Games versus Apple lawsuit was a deceptively simple question with massive consequences. Does Apple have the right to control how apps are distributed and monetized on the iPhone? Apple argued that it absolutely did. The iPhone, according to Apple, is a closed ecosystem by design. The App Store is not a public utility. It is a curated marketplace. Developers are free to leave. Consumers are free to choose Android. And Apple's rules, Apple said, protect users from fraud, malware, and privacy abuses. Epic told a very different story. According to Epic, Apple was not just a marketplace operator, it was a gatekeeper. Apple controlled app distribution, payments, discovery, and pricing, all while competing against developers within its own ecosystem. Epic argued that Apple's 30% commission was not the result of competition, but of coercion. If you wanted access to iPhone users, there was no alternative. No sideloading, no competing app stores, no negotiation. Pay the toll or disappear. As the trial unfolded in 2021, the courtroom became a rare window into Apple's inner workings. Internal emails were revealed, executive strategies were dissected. For the first time, the public saw how carefully Apple defended its control over the App Store. One of the most damaging revelations came from evidence showing that Apple selectively enforced rules, sometimes granting special treatment to large companies while denying the same flexibility to smaller developers. That single detail struck at the heart of Apple's fairness narrative. Epic's legal strategy focused heavily on antitrust law. The company argued that Apple had unlawfully tied app distribution to Apple's own payment system, forcing developers to use Apple's in-app purchases and prohibiting them from even informing users about alternative payment options. This practice, Epic claimed, inflated prices, reduced innovation, and harmed consumers. Apple countered that its commission funded the entire ecosystem, and that developers benefited massively from the platform Apple built. The judge faced an almost impossible task: define the market. Was Apple competing in the broader smartphone market, where Android existed as a strong alternative? Or was Apple monopolizing the market for iOS app distribution? That distinction would determine everything, and it's here where the case stopped being about Fortnite and became about the future of digital platforms. In September 2021, the court delivered a split decision that sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley. Apple was not declared a monopoly under federal antitrust law. That alone was a major relief for Apple and a disappointment for Epic. But the ruling did not let Apple walk away untouched. The court found that Apple's anti-steering provisions were anti-competitive under California law. Apple could no longer prohibit developers from linking to external payment options or informing users about alternative ways to pay. This nuance mattered more than headlines initially suggested. Apple won on monopoly claims, but lost on control over information. For the first time, a court ordered Apple to loosen its grip, even slightly, over how developers communicate with users. And Apple did not accept this quietly. It appealed. Epic appealed. The battle was far from over. Behind the legal technicalities was a financial shadow that loomed over everything. The so-called $100 billion figure was not a single damages claim, but a projection of the economic stakes. App Store revenue, service growth, platform fees, and future precedent all converged into a number that represented existential risk. If Apple lost full control of the App Store, its services business, one of its fastest-growing segments, could be fundamentally reshaped. And Apple wasn't the only company watching closely. Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Spotify, and countless developers studied every filing, every ruling, every hint of weakness. Governments did too. Regulators in the European Union accelerated the Digital Markets Act, explicitly targeting gatekeeper behavior like Apple's. In South Korea, lawmakers passed legislation forcing App Store operators to allow alternative payment systems. What began as a single lawsuit was triggering a global regulatory domino effect. Epic Games, meanwhile, was playing a long game. Even without Fortnite on iOS, Epic framed the lawsuit as a moral stand for developers everywhere. CEO Tim Sweeney repeatedly emphasized freedom, openness, and competition. Critics accused Epic of hypocrisy, pointing out that Epic takes its own commissions and tightly controls its platforms. Supporters argued that imperfect messengers can still expose real problems. Either way, Epic succeeded in one crucial objective: changing the conversation. For consumers, the implications were subtle but profound. Lower commissions could mean lower prices. Alternative payment systems could mean more choice. Competing app stores could mean more innovation or more risk. Apple leaned heavily on security arguments, warning that sideloading in third-party stores would invite malware and scams. Epic responded that security and competition were not mutually exclusive, and that Apple used fear to protect profits. As appeals continued, Apple made carefully framed changes to its App Store policies, often emphasizing compliance while preserving as much control as possible. Developers were technically allowed to link to external payments, but under strict conditions. Fees were adjusted, not eliminated. Control was softened, not surrendered. To Apple, this was responsible stewardship. To critics, it was calculated resistance. The Epic Games versus Apple lawsuit ultimately exposed something far larger than a billing dispute. It exposed how modern power works. Control today is not about factories or oil fields. It's about platforms, ecosystems, and rules written in code. Whoever controls the operating system controls commerce, speech, and innovation within it, and once that control is normalized, it becomes invisible, until someone challenges it. Epic did not destroy Apple's App Store. Apple did not crush Epic's rebellion. Instead, the case carved a crack in the wall, just wide enough for regulators, developers, and courts to peer through. That crack continues to widen as new laws, new lawsuits, and new technologies emerge. The question that remains is unresolved and deeply uncomfortable. When you tap an icon on your phone, who decides what happens next? The company that built the hardware? The developer who built the app? The regulator who wrote the law? Or the platform owner who controls the gate? Epic Games versus Apple did not deliver a clean victory or a dramatic defeat. It delivered something more dangerous to entrenched power: scrutiny. And in an economy increasingly defined by digital toll booths, scrutiny may be the first step toward real change. Because the next time you open an app, make a purchase, or subscribe with a single tap, remember this: behind that simplicity is a battlefield. And the outcome of that battle will decide not just how much you pay, but who truly controls your phone.